Today we're going to be talking about food webs. Needs of living things. All organisms need certain things in order to survive, such as food or energy, water, minerals, gases, and an appropriate environment. Today we're going to investigate how living things acquire their food. The main source of energy comes from the sun. Plants use the sun's energy for photosynthesis and create their own food. And animals eat plants, or they eat other animals that eat plants. But the main source of energy is the sun. Let's talk about producers. Plants are producers because they're organisms that make their own food through photosynthesis, using the energy from the sun. In this example, on the picture on the bottom of the screen, grass is a producer because grass makes its own food. Also, there's no arrow pointing to the grass, and that's how you know that the grass can make its own food. Consumers are organisms that cannot make their own food, and they get their energy by feeding on producers or other consumers. In the picture below, grasshoppers, frogs, and pythons are all consumers. You can tell that they're consumers because there's an arrow pointing at them. Primary consumers, also known as first-level consumers, are animals that eat producers in a food chain. So for example, grass is the producer. The thing that eats the grass, where the arrow is pointing at the grasshopper. The grasshopper is the first level or primary consumer. Secondary consumers, also known as second level consumers, are animals that eat first level consumers in a food chain. So in this example, the frog is a secondary consumer, because when you go back to the beginning of the food chain starts at grass. Grass gets eaten by grasshopper, which is first level. Grasshopper gets eaten by the frog, which is the second level consumer. The tertiary consumer, also known as the third level consumer, is an animal that eats a second level consumer. For example, the python. Your food chain starts with grass. Grass gets eaten by grasshopper. Grasshopper gets eaten by the frog, and the frog gets eaten by the python. So it goes producer, first level, second level, and third level. Decomposers are their own group. A decomposer is an organism that gets its energy by breaking down bodies of dead organisms and returning the nutrients back into the soil. For example, earthworms, bacteria, and fungi are decomposers. A food chain is what we have been talking about this whole time. A food chain is a diagram used to show how energy from food passes from one organism to another. So the energy to start a food chain always begins with the sun. And the arrows in a food chain means gets eaten by, and the arrows show which way the energy moves. In an ecosystem, a food web is more accurate. A food web is a diagram that describes several overlapping food chains in that area or in that ecosystem. It shows how energy moves through a community. So a food web is more accurate because an animal depends on more than one thing to eat, to keep itself alive. And that's why a food web is more accurate. It depicts the feeding relationship between many organisms in an ecosystem. Here's another example of a food web. The energy that starts a food web always comes from the sun. The first organism that you would write in your food web would be the plant, and you can tell what a plant is or what a producer is because there's no arrows going into the producer because the producer can make its own food. So in this example, you can tell that cordgrass is a producer because there's no arrow going into it. And you can also tell that detritus is a producer, even if you don't know what detritus is. By looking at this food web, you can tell detritus is a producer because, again, there's no arrow going into it because it makes its own food. So on the left, you see a food chain, which is just a feeding relationship between one organism to the next. And on the right, you see a food web, which more accurately depicts what happens in an ecosystem because organisms eat many or a variety of different things. So there's a couple different types of consumers. An herbivore is an animal that eats only plants, for example, a cow. An omnivore is an animal that eats both plants and animals, for example, humans and dogs. And a carnivore is an animal that eats only other animals, for example, tigers, hawks, and killer whales. And a scavenger is a type of consumer. It's an animal that eats decaying animals or plants, such as a hyena or a vulture. A scavenger is not a decomposer. Decomposers are their own separate group, and decomposers decay dead matter, but they also return the nutrients back into the soil. So that's the difference between a decomposer and a scavenger. A scavenger just eats dead things. Instead of hunting for itself, it just finds dead things and it is able to eat and digest them. Whereas a decomposer breaks down dead stuff and returns nutrients back into the soil. The predator-prey relationship, a predator is the hunter, like the lion, and the prey is the hunted, like the zebra in this picture.